check that you have registered to vote. Of course, we're still waiting for President Ramaphosa to proclaim that date. It's often said that these elections will be the most hotly contested elections since 1994, and that for some parties they could in fact turn out to be almost make or break elections. But what does the data from previous elections tell us about what will be the important dynamics of these polls?
There are other questions around which voters in which provinces have changed their voting behaviour in the past and why. And what does that tell us about predictions for what could happen when you go to vote in May? Joining us today are two people who've studied the numbers and the trends over the last few years. Professor Ivor Sarakinsky is at the Wits School of Governance. Angelo Fick is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming in this Sunday evening. Really appreciate it. Angelo, I'd like to start with you. I mean, key to this is about what makes voters change their minds. That really determines all elections and the results of them. Kwazulu-Natal might be a place to start. So it's seen evidence where people will change their minds. 1994, 2009 was an IFP-controlled province, sort of. Then it moved to the ANC. In 2009 in particular, the ANC share of the vote there shot up. Then in 2016, it seemed perhaps the IFP was making a little bit of a comeback. I mean, what does that tell us about what's driving voter trends in KwaZulu-Natal?
So I think we need first to distinguish between general elections and municipal elections. So in municipal elections, we know that smaller parties perform better than they do in general elections, in national elections. So what happened in KwaZulu-Natal was that the smaller parties had a much more local kind of base, shall we say. So when it comes to municipalities, parties like the IFP and the NFP performed much better than they did in that period after 2005 in the local elections. In national elections, what we've seen is a shift from the IFP support of the 1990s to a majority ANC support in the 2000s. And the test, I think, for the province will be whether or not that shift happens again, given the position of internal disarray within the ANC and given the external factors that impact on people's perceptions of the IFP and the ANC and other parties in the province.
I suppose, Professor Sarakinsky, I mean, key to that was that in 2009, Jacob Zuma was the leader of the ANC campaigning to be president. He spent a lot of time in rural KwaZulu-Natal, if I recall, and that partly drove up the ANC's share of the vote in that province.
Indeed it did. And also what helped the ANC was tensions between the NFP and the IFP, and the NFP being an offshoot of the IFP, and that could have divided that opposition vote as well. So it remains to be seen whether Zuma campaigning for the ANC in the run-up to this election will have either a positive or a negative effect. And we shouldn't be misled by the support he got at the manifesto launch.
Was actually about to bring it to that as well. We saw the support that he got at the January 8th statement. You speak of a friction between the IFP and the NFP, but let's bring it a bit more wide scale. The issue of violence within KwaZulu-Natal. We've seen what has happened. I mean, we still have no further details regarding what many have said was a political assassination of Sindiso Makaka, for example. Could this be a major problem that we will see in the run-up to this election and even post the election? Because if you're saying we're not supposed to judge by what the reception that the former president, Jacob Zuma, received, there was a lot of criticism about, you can clearly see where the lines seem to be drawn in KwaZulu-Natal.
Well, that is a tough issue at local level, where the stakes are so much higher in terms of people trying to become councillors and the access to patronage that being a councillor gives one. So the stakes being so high at local level, the violence, I think, escalated. At national, provincial level, it's not as close to patronage as local government. But I think the general point remains that KZN is a real problem in terms of political violence. The Gleblands hostel, the hiring of it people, all of that stuff could easily come into play. And it might be that in wards or in areas of KZN, people might instigate violence in one area to stop people going to the polls. These are kinds of possibilities that one should factor in, and the security sector needs to factor in terms of their risk analysis.
Angelo, could I ask about, I mean, you talk about this interesting dynamic where small parties do better in local elections than they do in national elections. Does this continue for by-elections? And I'm struck by the example in 2017 in May of Ngutu, and this was a council who couldn't elect a mayor, so eventually they had a by-election. The ANC threw everything at it. You know, then President Zuma went, then Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa went, and yet the IFP won it, I mean, incredibly convincingly. Why would that happen? I mean, what led to something like that? Or was it just that there was some other political dynamic where maybe Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi just knew more than they did about that area?
So there could be very specific local dynamics, and I think it's very important that we don't extrapolate from municipal electoral behaviour to national or general elections. So what could happen in a particular by-election is that there is a sense of shall we say, exclusion, where people feel that the person who won the election the first time around and that party didn't deliver, and so they're switching. Or, you know, despite all of the performance by a particular party in the electioneering, people still feel that there is a need to punish, or there's a loyalty that shifts. In general elections, what we'll see is people voting rationally along slightly more complicated rather than those initial first response issues. So their reputation of the party will be important, and not just the party's perceptions of its own reputation, but also how voters perceive that party's reputation. And I think what is important to state is that the IFP isn't necessarily a small party. So when I spoke of small parties, I spoke of those, you know, parties that often stand in general elections and don't make it into the National Assembly. But they get more votes in the, you know, sort of smaller elections, the kind of municipal elections, because they can concentrate their efforts more. For a small party to concentrate in one ward might get them something in a municipality. That same party may not be able to then catapult to the province. One party that did this successfully was the NFP, that started off as a local party, did well in municipal elections, got into the National Assembly, and then because of internal strife collapsed. And whether or not they can, you know, sort of recover from that is going to be the test of this particular election.
There are obviously lots of different variables in KwaZulu-Natal, and I want to come to the importance of it as a province in a moment. But in terms of variables, I mean, you'd look at the competition to the ANC, but you'd also look at the situation in the ANC. Professor Sarakinsky, would it be fair to say that perhaps the biggest variable is actually what happens in the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal rather than whatever any of the other political parties there do?
I think that the ANC will get the votes in KZN. I can't see any ANC supporting people in KZN boycotting the vote because of either former President Zuma campaigning in the area or a dislike for the current President Ramaphosa. So I think they'll get that won't have an impact. What might have an impact is disillusionment, in terms of what are these guys up to, what does it mean for us, I'm going to take a public holiday. And I think that the percentage of disillusionment might be the key variable to watch out for in KZN.
Let's take a look, gentlemen, at this graph here. It's the Ipsos poll. Basically, young voters 2016, young voters 2019, the ANC 47%, projections 62%. Judging from what we look at, let's just take the first three top political parties there. Does that look about accurate? Would we see an increase in the number of young people that would go out and vote this time around? There are a number of issues that young people are facing. The huge issue seems to be the high unemployment rate in South Africa, which could play a very, very key role. Angelo?
So there is that dynamic, which is what is going on in the political economy of South Africa, and how are political parties speaking to young people on those issues, and do young people feel that those political parties are, in a sense, addressing that? I'm not one to either put religious faith in polls nor to dismiss them, because I think we've all globally found out that polls can be pretty tricky issues. There is quite a long distance between now and the election. Much depends on the electioneering itself, but also in terms of how one asks young people what it is that they are looking for and how they will support. We know also that from, you know, data done by the HSRC that there are concerns around very low voter turnout among young people. So it depends again on whether or not young people turn up to vote, and whether or not they have identified the party. So this is not a kind of, it's not easy to predict.
What would these political parties need to say to young people? as you look, the young people of today are very different to, for example, let's make an example of the ANC, who would go out and say, do it for honey. I recall being at Wits University during the last local government election. Forgive me, I know you said that we should not make the comparison, but they would often say, don't tell me about Chris Hani. Those were their words. Tell me what you will do for me. If I leave this tertiary institution, will I be able to find a job? That's just an example. What would these political parties need to say to young people to galvanize them to go out and vote?
So post-millennial, post-apartheid South African youth, I think, have very different kinds of aspirations. And so if you're going to speak to them in rhetoric, as political parties tend to speak to voters, the rhetoric of what happened before 1994, the rhetoric of the ANC's role in liberating South Africa from apartheid, as it styles itself, all of those things, I think, do not speak to post-millennial voters who are young. First-time voters are looking for issues of resolutions of debt and education issues, job prospects, and also a sense of belonging in a country, and by that I don't just mean feeling like they're South Africans, but feeling as if there's a possibility of setting into the country without having to go through political patronage. And so life chances are important. So for very many people, it is about education and jobs and security in the middle classes, but for very many working class people, rural people, it is about being seen to be included in the largesse that has been, for middle class South Africa, the post-apartheid settlement, from which they have largely been excluded. We're the most unequal society in the world. We have the highest youth unemployment rate in the world, and that unemployment rate speaks to poverty. The OECD statistics told us that for the children of poor people to get to the same level equality of life and equality as the children of rich people would, at the current economic dispensation and dynamics, take 9 generations, which means it's not going to happen. And that, I think, is what young people want to have shifted.
Is there an element of personalities as well here? And Prof, I'd like to put this to you. I'm reminded of the sort of Barack Obama election in the United States of 2008, where the percentage of young people actually voting jumped up. I think some people thought Julius Malema might do that here, but I don't know if there's evidence to suggest that that happened. Personalities do matter. I've seen someone like Mmusi Maimane or Malusi Gigaba in 2014, a long time ago now, campaign in front of young people, and I've watched older people try and do it. They had a much better impact, those two politicians, than older ANC and DA leaders had. I mean, the personalities matter for younger people.
They absolutely do. And the thing about the youth is a bit more complicated, because the table you just showed is an indication that the youth are quite underrepresented on the voters' roll, and youth aren't registering to vote. So we want to watch the numbers for the voter registration that ended today closely to try and get a sense of whether there's a correction there, because I think that will have an impact on predicting outcomes. But of course the personalities have an impact, especially those who can communicate, articulate youth interests. And the ANC is trying to revitalize the Youth League because Malema had that skill of speaking to the youth, and he's built the EFF around a youth base. So all the politics around the EFF is linked into this. Does the ANC currently have anyone who can go out and talk to the youth, someone who's credible, someone who isn't tarnished by any of the controversies of the recent past? It doesn't seem like that. And if they let that constituency go, they're in trouble. Obama played the youth. He got the youth to register. He got them in, and that bounce is what got him elected. And the EFF's trying that, and the ANC, I think, is falling behind on that one.
Shall we move to Gauteng now? One of the other big provinces. I mean, in 2014, the ANC just won it, just under 54% of the vote. Angelo, what was driving that decline? I mean, they're obviously, when you look at Gauteng, most urbanized province in the country, perhaps quite difficult because it's got a large number of rich people than anywhere else, but also a very large number of poor people. It must make it harder for anyone to campaign in.
Well, it's the economic heartland of the country. It has I think the largest economy on the continent when it comes to cities, and accounts for something like 16% of GDP. So there is a real concern that this is where things ought to happen. And migration patterns to Gauteng certainly show that. So the growth in the population has to do with people coming here because they see opportunities here that are not elsewhere. That means that whoever governs here has to provide for those needs that people have articulated. And so one of the concerns that I think people had around the ANC in 2014 was that they didn't quite read the ANC as the ANC projected itself. And they did that again far more significantly in 2016 at the local government elections. And here I think the issue of what was then the Nkandla issue may not have impacted nationally quite as sharply as it impacted in Gauteng, with its urbanized population, with its economic needs, and with middle class, sort of senses of their control over the economy, their money being wasted on projects that they find deeply discomforting and distressing, and also the internal disarray of the ANC historically in this province cannot be discounted.
Two things. You talk about money being spent on things, so that brings to mind the issue of e-tolls. That has always been, one of the painstaking things for the ANC in Gauteng. Secondly, I want to talk about a change, Stephen. You'd noted that, a change in the leadership of the ANC. Stephen earlier indicating, just before we went to air, that perhaps part of what led to people not voting for the ANC in 2016 would be the whole issue surrounding the former President Jacob Zuma. Perhaps that could be said right now. Would a change in the face of the ANC, being now Cyril Ramaphosa, perhaps have a positive impact on the way perhaps the vote could go for Gauteng in the upcoming election?
I think the test there is whether or not the economic elites and those who rely on the economic elites of South Africa see in Cyril Ramaphosa what they didn't see in Jacob Zuma. I don't see this necessarily as a positive. I'm simply describing what could be out there. So Cyril Ramaphosa represents, for very many people, business investment, economic stability of the kind that they sort of long back for under the Thabo Mbeki years, which is economic growth. But as we look back at those years, economic growth without jobs. Any party, and here I agree with Ivor, that has any idea of governing either in the future near or in the future far, has to concentrate on the young population. The youth in South Africa, the majority. If you're going to stick to the old, and I'm one of the old, I'm 46, the majority of people are younger than I am in this country, you're going to have to realize that you are not speaking in the terms or aspirations of young people. And here I think parties like the African National Congress have a real crisis. And the real crisis is that they also need to do internal rewarding of people who've been in the movement for a very long time, want positions as a result of their work that they've put in, but at the same time speak to a young population that wants to see itself represented in power positions. So we've seen shifts in cabinet trying to accommodate the young. We've seen attempts to make young people more visible in the ANC. But, the ANC would have to get over the joke of being, 35.9 years old to be leader of the Youth League. This idea that the party is populated by the elderly, by people who are post-pension age, and it wants support from the young who are under 35. And that gap, I think, is a significant issue that has come up because, as Stephen has pointed out, people like Malusi Gigaba may not be able to be given the position that they've been given before because of their implication in all sorts of allegations that have gone around over the last 2 years.
Professor Sarakinsky, I mean, the other thing that's interesting about Joburg is the difference in the sort of regions of it. And if we look at Joburg in particular, you have township areas and suburban areas. In 2016, the massive difference was that people who had voted for the ANC in the past, generally people who lived in township areas in the main, and I mean in Joburg we're talking specifically around Soweto because it's so big, 1.3 million people, it's got a large number of voters, but it was in suburban turnout, so people in the suburbs, racial minority groups particularly, who all went to vote. I mean, some of the suburbs had 85% turnout for the Democratic Alliance. That was the difference, surely.
It was. And if one goes through the ward turnouts, ward by ward, one sees incredible numbers. The DA getting turnouts of in the 90s even in some wards compared to ANC strongholds in the 40s and 50 percentiles. So in a proportional representation system, those turnout variables are absolutely important, because if your voters stay away and your opposition voters come in, the ultimate number is calculated on the votes there. And that can skew the seats in the House. It can skew the seats in the provincial assemblies as well. So the big question is Ramaphosa able to bring back those disillusioned township voters in Soshanguve, in Soweto, in other parts of Gauteng? Because if they stay away again, Gauteng is on the brink of being lost to the ANC.
perhaps we'll be able to answer that question again after we come back from this break. We'll take a short break here on The Full View. We'll chat further on issues of the politics of the Western Cape and the Northwest, all coming up after the break. Please do stay with us.